The accidental hug. It was a cool spring morning at the bustling airport, the kind of morning where the sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the entire terminal. Emily stood near the large glass windows, gazing out at the crowd of people streaming through the entrance. She was barely 5 feet tall, which meant it was difficult to see much of anything above the sea of heads around her. But she was determined. Her heart raced with excitement and nerves as she eagerly searched for a familiar face in the crowd. Her older brother, Ethan, had been away for nearly a year. He'd been working abroad, and the last few months had felt like an eternity. But today was different. Today, he was finally coming home, and Emily could feel the anticipation building up inside her. She had missed him so much. As she stood on her tiptoes, straining to catch a glimpse of his arrival, something caught her eye. A silhouette. It was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair. It was him. It had to be. She could feel her heart leap into her chest. Without a second thought, she pushed through the crowd, weaving past people in a way that could only be described as a determined blur. She wasn't thinking about personal space or the fact that people were staring at her. She just needed to get to him, to feel the embrace she had been longing for all these months. Then, without hesitation, Emily rushed forward and threw herself into the waiting arms. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his chest. But as she felt his arms envelop her, something immediately struck her as odd. His chest was solid, firm, far too firm. And there was something different about the way he smelled. It wasn't the usual scent of Ethan's worn-out cologne. This was something more sophisticated. A woody, elegant fragrance, one that seemed far too refined for her brother. A rush of panic shot through Emily's body. She slowly pulled her head back, raising her eyes to look up at the man she had so eagerly embraced. And that's when it hit her. This wasn't Ethan. Her stomach dropped as she took in the sight of the man in front of her. He wasn't just any man. He was striking. His features were sharp and perfectly defined. His dark hair was neatly styled, and he was wearing a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it had just been picked out of a high-end fashion magazine. His eyes, gray like storm clouds, locked onto hers with an intense gaze, a mixture of surprise and amusement in his expression. Emily felt a rush of heat flood her cheeks. She had just hugged a complete stranger, a very handsome, very wealthy stranger. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Emily felt the awkwardness wrapping around her like a thick, suffocating blanket. She opened her mouth, ready to apologize, but nothing came out at first. "Oh my God," she finally managed, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. I got the hug wrong. I hugged the wrong person. I'm so sorry." She jumped back, her legs feeling like jelly. Her face turned bright red, and she instinctively wanted to curl into a ball and disappear from the world. The stranger stood there for a moment, his expression unmoving. But after a beat, the corner of his mouth twitched, and a small, amused smile tugged at his lips. He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly entertained by the chaos unfolding before him. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, his voice smooth and rich. Emily's eyes widened. She was mortified. And to make matters worse, she wasn't sure if she was more embarrassed by the fact that she had hugged the wrong man, or by the fact that this was one of the most handsome men she had ever seen in her life. "I thought you were my brother," she stammered, waving her hands frantically, as if to somehow explain away her mistake. "He's tall, he has dark hair, and I didn't get a good look. I saw his reflection in the glass, and thought it was him. But—" "Emotional nearsightedness," he interrupted, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Is that what you're calling it?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying her discomfort. Emily blinked in confusion. "Emotional? What?" "Emotional nearsightedness," he repeated with a smirk. "It happens when emotions are so strong. They cloud your judgment. You see what you want to see, instead of what's really in front of you." He leaned forward slightly, watching her, still entertained. "Oh God, I need to stop talking," Emily whispered to herself, feeling her entire body flush with embarrassment. Before she could sink further into mortification, a large, looming figure suddenly appeared beside them. The security guard was enormous, dressed in a crisp black suit, a wall of muscle standing just behind the stranger. His stern gaze swept over Emily, who stood frozen, still reeling from the most awkward moment of her life. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right?" the security guard asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Mr. Carter. The name sent a jolt through Emily's mind. Carter, as in Brian Carter, the billionaire financial tycoon who avoided the spotlight as much as he could, yet whose name was known around the world. The man she had just mistakenly hugged. "Oh no," she whispered, her stomach twisting into knots. This was Brian Carter, the man who had more money than most people could ever dream of, the man who was practically a legend in the business world. And she had just thrown herself at him like he was some long-lost relative. Brian seemed to notice the panic in her eyes. He smiled then, an almost amused smile, his gray eyes twinkling with something mischievous. "You look nervous," he observed with a hint of laughter in his voice. "Are you afraid of billionaires?" Emily blinked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of making embarrassing mistakes and ending up all over the internet." "Understandable," Brian said with a shrug, glancing around the airport. "But don't worry, no harm done." His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Before Emily could even try to recover from this fiasco, she muttered, "I need to find my brother. And maybe change my identity, move to Alaska." Brian chuckled, clearly entertained by her plight. "Well, good luck with that," he said, crossing his arms and watching her scurry away. As Emily walked off, her cheeks still burning with embarrassment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something strange, had just happened. But for the life of her, she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She'd hugged the wrong man, and he was a billionaire. But there was more to this encounter than she realized. More than the awkwardness, more than the blushing, more than the potential disaster. Something told her that this wasn't the last time she crossed paths with Brian Carter. Something had shifted in the air, and Emily had no idea how much her life was about to change. A life of surprises. The next few days passed in a blur. Emily found herself walking through her usual routine like an automaton, focusing on her work, getting through the day, and attempting to shake off the embarrassing incident at the airport. She couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in her head, cringing with every thought. She had, quite literally, thrown herself at a billionaire. If there were an award for the most awkward airport encounter, Emily was pretty sure she'd be the undisputed champion. The airport cafe, where Emily worked as a barista, was busy as usual. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Working behind the counter, she served coffee, sandwiches, and pastries to a steady stream of travelers, most of whom barely noticed the hard work she put into every cup she brewed. It was a thankless job, but it helped support her younger brother, who was still in high school, and that was all that mattered to her. The exhaustion from long shifts was starting to take its toll. Emily had grown used to the relentless pressure of the airport cafe. Rich people demanding their overpriced lattes, impatient customers grumbling about waiting in line, and the constant hum of the coffee machines. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was what she had for now. She was wiping down the counter one afternoon when she noticed a familiar figure walking in through the front door. A chill ran down her spine. It was him, Brian Carter. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly tried to compose herself. No, this couldn't be happening. She was just imagining things, right? But there he was, walking towards the same table where he had sat a few days ago. His piercing gray eyes scanned the room, and his gaze settled on her immediately. Brian was dressed impeccably again. His tailored suit, sleek and dark, made him look like he had just walked out of a magazine cover shoot. His presence alone seemed to command the room, even though he was sitting in a quiet corner of the cafe. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. She couldn't avoid him forever, right? She had to do her job, no matter how awkward this was. With a sigh, she grabbed her notepad and made her way over to him, trying to maintain her professional composure. But inside, her nerves were running wild. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," Emily said, forcing a polite smile onto her face. "What can I get for you today?" Brian didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking with hers in a way that made her feel like he could see right through her. He had this way of looking at people like he was studying them, dissecting every small detail. It was unnerving, but in a strangely magnetic way. "Well," he began slowly, his voice smooth and low. "I think I'll have a coffee, but I'd like it made by you." Emily blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" she asked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "I want you to make it," Brian repeated, the corners of his lips curling into a slight, teasing smile. "I've had coffee from plenty of people, but I'd like to see if you're as good at making it as you are at giving awkward hugs." Emily felt her face heat up immediately, the memories of their first encounter flooding back. "Oh God," she muttered under her breath, mortified all over again. She had to admit, the man had a knack for getting under her skin. "Don't worry," Brian said, his voice softening a little. "I promise I won't bite. Just make it however you like." Emily couldn't decide whether she wanted to crawl under the table or just walk away, but she stood her ground and gave him another tight smile. "All right, I'll get that for you." As she turned to walk back to the counter, she couldn't help but wonder why he had come back. Why was he here? He was a billionaire, and here she was, just a girl working a job that barely covered rent. There was no reason for someone like Brian Carter to pay any attention to her, especially after the embarrassing mistake she had made. Yet there he was, looking at her with that same intensity as before. The coffee machine hummed as Emily went to work, trying her best to push aside the thoughts swirling in her mind. She focused on the task at hand, grinding the beans, steaming the milk, and preparing the coffee with the precision that had become second nature. When she returned with the coffee, Brian was sitting casually, his arms resting on the back of his chair. He glanced up at her as she set the cup down in front of him. "Thank you," he said, his voice rich with appreciation. "You know, I wasn't expecting it to be so good." Emily smiled faintly. "Of course it's good. I work here, remember?" Brian leaned in slightly, taking a sip of the coffee and nodding with approval. "I'll admit, you surprised me," he said. "Most people don't expect someone like you to be so good at what you do." Her eyebrows furrowed. "Someone like me?" she asked, surprised by his comment. "What do you mean by that?" He smiled, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "You don't seem like the kind of person who would settle for a job like this. You've got ambition. I can see it in your eyes. You don't belong here." His words caught her off guard. She had never really thought about it that way. Yes, she had dreams, big ones, but she had also learned to be practical. Reality had a way of grounding her ambitions. She had responsibilities. She had to pay bills, support her brother, and make sure they stayed afloat. This job, though far from glamorous, was the only way she could manage to do that. "I'm here because I have to be," Emily said quietly, almost to herself. "I've got bills to pay, and my brother. I have to make sure he's taken care of." Brian watched her for a moment, his expression softening. "I understand that, but I still think you're capable of more. People like you, people with your determination, they usually find a way to rise above." Emily stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. What did he mean? Was he just being polite, or was there something more behind it? She wasn't sure, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but be intrigued by him. Just as she was about to respond, her manager, Mr. Phillips, appeared, his usual forced enthusiasm plastered on his face. "Ah, Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you here again," he said, practically fawning over the billionaire. "I trust everything is to your satisfaction." Brian gave a small nod, glancing between Mr. Phillips and Emily. "I'm quite satisfied, actually. Emily's been taking good care of me." Phillips froze for a moment, clearly taken aback. Then he quickly nodded and turned to Emily with a sharp look. "Well, Emily, if you're done here, we need to get back to work." But before Emily could walk away, Brian stopped her. "Wait," he said, his voice firm yet kind. "I'd like Emily to continue serving me today." Phillips hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request, but Brian's commanding presence left him with little choice. "Of course, Mr. Carter," he said quickly, "but we can't leave other customers waiting." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Then have someone else cover for her." Emily glanced between them, caught in an awkward tension, but Brian simply smiled at her, a reassuring smile that somehow made her feel at ease despite everything. "Relax," he said. "I enjoy good conversations." And just like that, Emily found herself stuck with the very man who had caused her so much embarrassment in the first place. But something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning of something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. An unexpected connection. The days following Brian Carter's unexpected appearance at the cafe were strange, and Emily couldn't quite shake the feeling that everything in her life was shifting. She found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. The world she had known, the quiet, predictable routine, had been suddenly upended by this billionaire who had walked into her life in the most absurdly unintentional way. Emily couldn't help but wonder why he kept coming back to the cafe, why he seemed to take such a keen interest in her. After that first encounter, she tried to brush off his comments, trying to focus on her job and get back to her daily grind. But each time he returned, he made it harder to ignore the invisible thread that seemed to tie them together. As the days passed, Brian continued to show up at the cafe, never demanding, always polite, and surprisingly easy to talk to. It wasn't as if he flaunted his wealth around her, something she appreciated, but there was an undeniable charisma about him. It wasn't just the money or the power that radiated from him. It was the confidence with which he carried himself. And there was something in the way he spoke, something genuine, even though his life was far removed from the ordinary. One morning, after another busy shift, Emily wiped her tired hands on her apron, glancing over to see Brian sitting at his usual corner. This time, he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, her platinum blonde hair styled in the sharpest bob. Emily could tell that the woman was far more accustomed to luxury than she would ever be. The woman seemed to laugh at something Brian said, and Emily found herself almost jealous. It wasn't rational, she knew that, but she couldn't help the pang of insecurity that tugged at her. Brian seemed so effortlessly composed around people of his world, people who belonged in that world. Pushing the feeling aside, Emily went about her duties, pretending not to notice them. She refilled coffee cups, served a few pastries, and greeted customers with the practiced smile that came naturally now. But every so often, her gaze would drift back to Brian, who was still talking with the woman, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he listened intently. Just as Emily was about to take a quick break, the woman stood up, adjusting her blazer and laughing as she gathered her things. Emily watched as the woman bent down to kiss Brian on the cheek, but it wasn't a playful gesture. It was more familiar. Before Emily could stop herself, the words tumbled out of her mouth before she could think twice. "Who's that?" she asked aloud, more to herself than anyone else. Brian, who had caught the tail end of her question, looked up with a raised eyebrow, his lips curling into a small, almost amused smile. "That's Vanessa. She works in real estate. We're old friends," he replied casually, as if their interaction wasn't entirely personal. Emily nodded quickly, trying to mask the disappointment she felt. She hadn't even realized she was feeling disappointed until the words left her mouth. Vanessa, she was everything Emily wasn't. Beautiful, polished, sophisticated. And Emily, well, Emily was just Emily, a small-town girl trying to make ends meet. But as she turned to walk away, she heard Brian's voice call her name. "Emily," he said, and his tone made her stop in her tracks. She turned to find him watching her, his gray eyes softening just a little. "Don't worry, I'm not interested in her." The words caught her completely off guard, and for a brief moment, she thought she might have imagined them. "You're not?" Emily asked, her voice betraying her curiosity. Brian shook his head slowly, his smile never fading. "No, Vanessa's. Well, she's a nice person, but she's not the one who's been making me look forward to my coffee every morning." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She felt her face flush and struggled to keep herself composed. Was he actually saying what she thought he was saying? "Why would I want to focus on someone who doesn't even understand what it's like to have a real conversation?" he added. "You, on the other hand, seem to know exactly what I mean." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood there for a moment, feeling her pulse race. Was she actually hearing this correctly? Did he really just say that to her? She was nothing like the women Brian was used to. She was a barista, an anonymous face behind the counter. And yet, somehow, in some strange way, it seemed that Brian was taking an interest in her. The silence between them stretched for a few moments before Emily finally spoke. "I don't know what to say." Brian gave her a playful smile, leaning back in his chair as if this were all just a casual conversation. "You don't have to say anything. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you the truth. I'm enjoying our talks. They're different." Emily looked at him, her mind swirling with a mix of confusion, disbelief, and curiosity. "I don't even know why you're talking to me," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. You're a billionaire, and I'm just, well, me." Brian's eyes softened. "And that's exactly what I like about you. You don't put on a show. You're real." His smile faded slightly as he studied her, and for a moment, there was something almost vulnerable in his eyes. "In my world, everyone has a mask. It's exhausting, honestly. But with you, I feel like I can just be." The words lingered in the air between them, thick with an unspoken understanding. Emily wasn't sure if she should feel flattered or confused, but something inside her told her that Brian wasn't just trying to flatter her. There was something deeper behind his words, something she couldn't quite place. Before she could respond, her manager, Mr. Phillips, appeared with his usual rushed demeanor. "Emily, can you please go check on table 4? They're waiting on their order." "Sure," she replied, her voice suddenly distant as she walked away from Brian's table, her thoughts racing faster than her feet could move. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something, a cliff, maybe, and she wasn't sure whether she should jump or walk away. As Emily walked toward the counter, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Brian Carter had said things to her that no one had ever said before, and for the first time in a long time, she started to wonder if there was more to her life than the mundane cycle she had been stuck in for so long. She didn't know what was happening between her and Brian. All she knew was that her world was beginning to change, and she wasn't sure whether it was for better or worse. But whatever it was, she couldn't deny that it felt different. And that feeling, a strange, thrilling feeling, was something she couldn't ignore. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.